Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Dream Catcher. The dark night hid behind thick clouds that hung over the village. In the fog and stillness, everything seemed lifeless, and the houses themselves looked like the last islands of life in an ocean of darkness. On such a night, the sky became not just an emptiness, but something tangibly evil and terrifying. And it was on this night, when coldness reigned everywhere and the air smelled of rain, that Mason, a 17-year-old boy, woke up. His heart was racing, and the air around him became dense. Mason felt as if there was a strange presence, and he couldn't understand what it was. That night, he couldn't sleep. And this wasn't a simple restless awakening. It was something else. He felt like something was watching him, or perhaps someone, hiding in the darkness, was still in his room. But, as always, nothing could be seen. Restlessness quickly turned into true fear. Mason remembered how, a few days earlier, rumors had been circulating in the town about strange people who appeared in the middle of the night and took those who had no luck in falling asleep by dawn. All the stories about them had one thing in common. People said that before their arrival, you could smell an imperceptible odor of dampness and salt, and soon after, sleep would bring the worst nightmares. They weren't just scary, these dreams could take your soul. Mason decided that it was simply a local myth. But the more he tried to forget about it, the worse he felt. Those thoughts, like the bad smell, wouldn't leave his mind. And at the moment when he tried to close his eyes, he felt something cold on his neck. Cold and unpleasant. He had no strength to turn his head, no strength even to exhale. Then he heard a whisper, barely audible, but so close that Mason's heart stopped. It wasn't just whispering, it was something alive, something that couldn't be part of his dream. "Don't sleep, don't sleep," the voice whispered, like an order, like a threat. Mason got out of bed and instantly saw her. It was a figure in black, with eyes that glowed like two small lights in the abyss. She stood right in front of him, and though her face was hidden by darkness, he could see how she moved, like a black shadow slicing through the air. "You don't respect their rules," the figure said. Mason didn't understand what it meant, but he felt that these words promised something incredibly terrifying. "If you want to survive, you should leave your dreams in peace," she continued. Mason tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the fog that suddenly appeared in the room. And that's when he realized, this wasn't just a nightmare. This was reality, and it was coming to take what he couldn't hold on to. Meanwhile, in the village, the elders spoke of dream catchers, beings who had come from hell. They collected human souls, and special dreams were their prey. And anyone who encountered them found themselves on the brink of life and death. Many thought that dream catchers were just scary stories, but Mason now knew that this was a terrible truth. He felt his strength leaving him, and her hands slowly enveloped his body, pulling him into the darkness. And then he heard the voice again, but this time, it was very close, as if the words were coming from the very depths of his own mind. "You will become one of us, Mason. You will become my catch." Mason understood that there was only one thing left for him to do: fight. But how could he fight something that was beyond reality? How could he defeat what lived in every one of his dreams? Mason tried to gather himself, to break free from its grip, but the creature's hands were as cold as ice and seemed to have become part of the air itself. They squeezed him, and his heart beat like a drum with every new movement. He tried to breathe, but it became heavy, like trying to breathe in fog, when the air is thick and hostile. "You can't escape from us," the creature whispered, its voice echoing from deep within the darkness. "We are not just dreams. We are your nightmare that walks beside you. And you won't be able to get rid of it." Mason tried to scream again, but no sound came out. He felt as if his consciousness was starting to melt away, and he was drowning in this unseen darkness. And then he saw something so terrifying that his heart nearly stopped. On the walls of his room, horrible drawings began to appear. Faces, broken bodies, blood flowing in black streams. Each drawing was like a little window into the nightmare that was chasing him. "This is only the beginning," the figure whispered again. "All your dreams are now mine. And every nightmare you experience will be worse than the last." Mason realized that something terrible was happening not just to him, but to everyone who had fallen into the clutches of this creature. He remembered how his mother, when he was a child, had told him about dream catchers, people who took the worst nightmares and dreams, and along with them, stole souls. It wasn't just a myth, it was a real curse that dragged a person into its endless web. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Mason shouted, gathering all his will. He didn't know whether he was still in reality or in a dream, but he decided not to give up. He had to do something to break free from this cycle. But the dark figure began to melt away, its contours blurred in the air. And when its face became visible, Mason saw it. It was horrific, charred, with many open eyes staring at him from all sides. He felt those eyes penetrating his soul, draining the last ounce of his strength. "You can't escape from us," the creature repeated. "And your worst nightmares are waiting for you." Mason felt his legs buckle, and the ground beneath him crumbled into dust. His soul longed to escape, but nothing helped. He no longer understood where reality ended and where the terror he was experiencing began. Suddenly, another figure appeared in the darkness, not as terrifying, but still dark. Mason didn't know whether it was a friend or an enemy, but it was his only hope. The figure approached, and Mason heard its voice. It was a different whisper from the one that had come from the first creature. This voice was warm, like a reminder of long-forgotten things. "Mason, wake up. You can defeat this. You must wake up." And though the voice sounded like it was all just a dream, he felt the cold that had tormented him slowly fading from his body, like the shadow that had reached his soul was dissipating. Mason realized that he wasn't the only source of this darkness. There was strength within him that he could use to fight. And though the dark creature was still whispering in his head, he was no longer afraid. Mason began to dig, to search for an exit, and suddenly, his eyes opened. He woke up in his bed, soaked with sweat, his heart pounding wildly. But the feeling was strange. Everything seemed so real that he couldn't tell whether it was a nightmare or reality. He got out of bed and immediately saw her, the black shadow in the corner of his room. And now Mason knew, this dream catcher would never let him go until he fulfilled his part of the bargain. And the scariest part was that the deal seemed to have just begun. Mason couldn't believe his eyes. The shadow in the corner of his room was still there, and although it didn't move, its presence was so heavy that it felt like every breath was draining him of all his energy. It wasn't just a ghost or a trace in his mind. This was a real entity, living in his nightmares, and now it was haunting him even in the real world. He slowly approached the shadow, but with each step, it felt as though something was preventing him from moving forward. Mason couldn't understand why this was happening. What did it want from him? Why was he, of all people, caught in its grasp? "You didn't respect the rules, Mason," its voice echoed, as if coming from the deepest pit of hell. The shadow began to stir, and the movement was so powerful that the walls of the room shook. I can't leave you," Mason replied, feeling his voice constrict with pain. He couldn't allow it to take everything that was his, everything he loved and held dear. But inside, he had the sense that the battle he was fighting wasn't just about his will to live. It was a battle that had been going on forever, a fight between dreams and reality. The shadow began to take form, becoming something bigger. At first, it was just a mass of darkness, but now, outlines began to appear. Mason saw a face that could have been human, but its eyes, those eyes were unnatural. They were empty, like the depths of the universe, swallowing all light. He felt a cold and terrifying chill emanating from those eyes. "I'm not just a dream catcher, Mason," the creature spoke, its voice growing louder, vibrating in every cell of his body. "I am your worst reality, your most terrifying fears, reborn in flesh. And now I've come to take you because you've become part of me." Mason realized it wasn't just about the nightmares. She was part of him, a part of his dark thoughts that he had never wanted to acknowledge. All those emotions he had kept buried inside, all his fears and pains, they had become this horrifying shadow, now seeking to consume him completely. "You don't have the strength to defeat me," the creature said, drawing closer to him, each step squeezing the space around him. "Because you can't escape from yourself." In that moment, Mason understood. It wasn't a battle against something external. This was a fight for his own soul. He couldn't give up, because giving up meant handing himself over to the darkness that had been chasing him. He felt something stir inside him, a source of strength that had never manifested before. It wasn't just a will to live, it was a desire to conquer his own fears. "I won't give up," Mason declared, for the first time feeling such resolve within him. "You can take my dreams, but you won't take my soul." And then something incredible happened. He felt something powerful ignite within him. It was his consciousness, his will, becoming stronger than any nightmare. He stared at the creature, and with every glance, his strength grew. The shadow began to tremble, as if it feared what it had created. Mason approached the dark figure, never breaking his gaze from its terrifying eyes. "I won't let you take me," he whispered, and at that moment, the entire space around him began to change. The darkness faded, dissolving, and in its place, a web of light appeared, entangling the monster, transforming it into a meaningless shadow. Mason didn't know how it happened, but he felt that his will, his consciousness, had become his weapon. The whole room returned to normal, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the battle had only been temporarily won. The dream catcher remained in the shadow, but its dark presence never left his thoughts. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the first victory, and each new nightmare he faced would bring him closer to the final battle. But now, Mason was ready. Because he understood, the most terrifying enemy wasn't the one who came from the darkness. The most terrifying enemy was the one who hid inside you. Mason sat on his bed, listening to the silence that filled the room. Everything around him seemed too calm, too peaceful after the horrors he had just gone through. But he knew it was just an illusion. The dreamcatcher hadn't gone anywhere, and even if it had temporarily retreated, the monster was simply waiting patiently for the next opportunity to claim his soul. Mason felt his heart beat a little more steadily, but his mind was filled with anxiety. He could no longer rely on the idea that everything would be fine, that some dark force would simply be defeated and everything would return to normal. From the moment he had encountered the dream catcher, everything had changed. He understood that he had to find a way to defeat it once and for all, because as long as he lived, the shadow of the dream catcher would follow him, even when he woke up. These thoughts wouldn't let him rest. Mason got up from the bed and walked over to the window, his gaze falling on the night sky. All he could see was darkness and one small star, as if it were fighting to exist amid the impenetrable dark mass. And it reminded him of his own struggle. He knew he could no longer allow his fears to control him. If the dream catcher was his dark experiences, his terrors coming to life, then he had to learn how to deal with them. If he didn't want to be their victim, he had to find a way to become stronger than his own nightmares. The next morning, Mason began his search. He wandered through the city, asking people if they had heard of dream catchers. He knew it might be nothing more than a myth, but his intuition told him that somewhere there was an answer that would help him overcome this curse. Meetings with people who had experienced something similar became more frequent. Some said they had seen these same shadows, others had heard sinister whispers at night, but they all agreed on one thing: dream catchers didn't just steal souls through nightmares. They acted through the weaknesses and fears of people, pulling them into their own reality, where there was no escape. In an old library, among dusty books, Mason found what he was looking for. It was an ancient manuscript that spoke about dreams and their power. It described creatures that could manipulate the human mind, plunging it into endless nightmares. However, there was one important detail that was never mentioned. Only those who had faced a dream catcher and survived could break this reality. And the key to this was to acknowledge one's fears and stop manifesting them into reality. You can't escape what's inside you, the book said. Only when you accept it, your nightmare will no longer have power over you. Mason realized this was the moment of truth. He would have to fight not only against external nightmares, but also accept everything he had been so afraid of in his heart. He had to face his greatest fears head-on. And that evening, when the night once again filled the city with its dark mist, Mason felt the familiar sensation. Something cold crept into his room. And once again he heard that same whisper, "You can't escape." But now he was ready. He knelt before the dark shadow and, from the depths of his soul, shouted, "I'm no longer afraid of you. You won't take my fears." And the darkness around him began to dissolve, as if it itself were nothing but a reflection of his own doubts. The dream catcher disappeared, dispersing into the dark air, and Mason felt how a part of his soul, which he had long hidden, was becoming whole again. He was no longer a victim. And although the dream catcher might return, he already knew how to stand against it. Mason reached his hand towards the light that was streaming through his window and understood. He had won. But this victory wasn't just over an external enemy. It was a victory over himself. Although Mason had defeated the dream catcher, his heart couldn't shake the sense of anxiety. The night had once again become safe, but he knew the darkness didn't give up so easily. Something remained beyond his reach, something that could awaken that terror he had already faced. The real battle wasn't in the physical world, it was in his mind. Weeks passed, and at first glance, life seemed to return to normal. Mason no longer experienced the nightly horrors, didn't hear the terrifying voices, or see the black shadows in the corners. However, some changes were imperceptible at first. He had become more detached, sinking deeper into his thoughts with each passing day. His gaze sometimes became distant, and his dreams increasingly pulled him back to the dark abyss he thought he had overcome. One night, when he lay down to sleep again, he felt the familiar cold. This time, he wasn't confused, but he didn't feel that usual calm either. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, everything around him began to dim, and he found himself in a different place. Not in his room, not in his familiar reality. This was another world, a dark, cold one, like a starless night. Mason stood on a lonely road, and even when he looked ahead, he couldn't see the end. Back again? A voice came from the darkness. It was the same whisper, the same shadow, and although its face was blurred, Mason could feel how every movement of it shook him from within. "You still don't understand," it said, its voice filled with cold contempt. "You can't defeat me, because I am you. I am your dark side. Your abyss." Mason recalled the words from the book he had found. Only when you accept your fears, your nightmare will no longer have power over you. But now, he understood that it wasn't just a metaphor. It was reality. And though he thought he had accepted his dark sides, he hadn't fully grasped it all. "You won't win, because you don't exist. You are only a reflection of my fears, my pains, my worst moments," Mason replied, trying to gather his resolve. And while the words sounded confident, anxiety still reigned inside him. "You don't understand," the shadow spoke, beginning to become more tangible, its outlines sharpening. "My worst nightmares are already a part of your soul. You can't get rid of them, no matter how hard you try." Mason felt the darkness begin to constrict around him. He tried to fight, but the compressed air made it hard for him to breathe. Then he remembered something that shifted his perception of reality. "To get rid of me, you don't need to defeat me," he said, his gaze becoming piercing. "You must accept me as part of yourself. I am you. I'm not the enemy. I am your strength." And in that moment, when Mason embraced his dark side, it vanished. The darkness gradually retreated, and in its place appeared a soft light from the world within his soul. He no longer felt the weight. He no longer feared the shadow that had once haunted him. And though Mason knew the dream catcher would never completely disappear, he also understood that now he could live with it, not allowing it to consume him again. He was no longer a victim of his fear. He had become the master of his nightmares. After Mason finally confronted his dark side, he began to feel changes not only in his dreams but also in his everyday life. Previously, any careless glance into the darkness or a noise at night would fill him with fear, but now everything was different. He no longer feared. His fears no longer had power over him, and it was both calming and terrifying at the same time. Mason started to realize that the existence of the dream catcher hadn't been a coincidence. It wasn't just a nightmare, but part of the process. The dream catcher was a kind of mirror that reflected everything Mason had hidden within himself: doubts, anxiety, guilt. And even though he no longer feared the terrifying shadows, he understood that fighting them had been only the beginning. His world had changed. Now, when he opened his eyes in the morning, he felt a strange clarity. The world around him seemed sharper, the colors brighter, and the sounds deeper. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, his mind would return to the dark room, where the dream catcher was not just a monster but a part of himself. He began to explore his past, searching for moments when his inner fears might have created the dream catcher. And then, among the memories, he found something that surprised him. A small moment from his childhood, one he had forgotten or might never have remembered if he hadn't been seeking answers. It was the moment when he lost his brother in a tragic accident. And although he had never spoken about it openly, those feelings had fueled his greatest fear, that he couldn't protect the one he loved. Mason realized that the dream catcher wasn't just a creature, but a reflection of his greatest loss and unresolved emotions. And every time he feared or doubted himself, the dream catcher, embodied in darkness, would return to remind him of that pain. But now he was no longer afraid. Now Mason could look into the darkness and see not a monster, but his own soul, unfinished, incomplete, but ready for change. He had learned to live with that pain. And even when his nightmares returned at night, he no longer ran from them, but embraced them. This was his path to true victory, not over the dream catcher, but over his fear, over himself. One day, Mason returned to the place where it all began. The forest that had once borne witness to his nightmares had now become a symbol of his healing. He stood by the same tree where everything started, and when he closed his eyes, he felt something shift again. And once again, just like in those days when nightmares were his only reality, he felt the presence of the dream catcher. Shadows wrapped around his body, and that familiar cold. But this time, he didn't try to run. He didn't clench his fists in battle. He simply said, "I accept you." The darkness paused for a moment, then dissolved. The dream catcher was no longer a fear ruling over him. It was simply a part of him, part of his own life. And in that moment, when Mason accepted it, the darkness dissipated, leaving only light. Mason realized that true freedom wasn't about running from his dark sides, but about learning to live with them. The nightmares no longer had power over him, and though the dream catcher still occasionally appeared in his dreams, Mason no longer feared it. He was ready for any challenge, because now he knew, true strength lies not in avoiding the darkness, but in learning to walk among it without losing oneself. Mason didn't immediately realize that his inner victory was just the beginning of a new phase in his life. His relationship with reality had become different, more insightful. He no longer felt fear every time night enveloped his city, but with each new morning, he became more aware that his struggle was far from over. One evening, as he sat on his apartment balcony, watching the fog cover the streets, a new thought crossed his mind. What if the dream catcher wasn't just a part of his dark soul? What if it wasn't just the result of internal struggles and pain, but a powerful force in the world, manipulating many people and making them face their deepest fears? These thoughts consumed him. What if this dream catcher was more than a personal tragedy, but part of a global force, growing stronger with each generation? He began searching for answers again. Throughout the time since his victory over his nightmares, he had tried to forget about the dream catcher. But now, with clarity, new questions filled his mind. Mason visited libraries, found ancient manuscripts, and asked people, but none of his searches provided definitive answers. However, one day, during a chance meeting with a strange old man in one of the very libraries, he learned something terrifying. The man, who appeared simple and harmless, knew more than he should have. He told Mason that the dream catcher was only part of an ancient entity that exists in the world through the fears and pains passed down through generations. It was a being called the essence of nightmarish terror. It could enter dreams, live in people's fears, and turn those fears into reality. "We are all part of this circle," the man said, his gaze penetrating and strangely calm. "You can't defeat the dream catcher without defeating the very essence that created it." Mason pondered this. He realized that what he had feared was just one form of this entity. The dream catcher was not the ultimate goal, but just a tool. To destroy it, he needed to go deeper, to the root. So Mason began a new journey, far more dangerous than any he had undertaken before. This time, he headed to an ancient city he had read about in books and manuscripts, once considered a place of power and mythical creatures. There, amidst the ruins, there was said to be an ancient temple where he could find the answers. Though he knew that with each step he took, he was getting closer to a truth that was better left unknown, he could no longer stop. After several days of traveling through forests and forgotten roads, Mason reached this place. The temple stood amidst stone ruins, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Its walls were covered with cryptic signs and symbols, which seemed to change depending on how you looked at them. Mason felt his heart quicken. Was this the end of his search? Had he found the true source of the evil that had sent him into his nightmares? Entering the temple, he saw flickering lights in the darkness, glowing like eyes, and a hollow voice that sounded distant, as if from another world. "You cannot stop this, Mason. The dream catcher will always be your companion. Don't think you can change this." But Mason knew. He no longer feared. Now he was ready to face the truth, even if it was more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. Mason stood deep within the temple, where the air was heavy with ancient spells. The brittle stones beneath his feet and the walls covered with age-old markings seemed to absorb every drop of light. All his senses were focused on the voice emanating from the darkness and what might lie ahead. He took a step forward. "You can't change this. It's part of your nature. Once the dream catcher takes hold of your soul, you can never be rid of it," the voice echoed from every corner of the temple, like a reverberation that penetrated every nerve in his body. But Mason felt himself growing stronger with each passing moment. He was no longer the frightened young man who had first confronted terror. He was no longer just fighting the dream catcher, but the very fears that had long taken root within his soul. "It's not your strength," the voice grew louder, closer. "It's just a shadow hiding inside you." Mason closed his eyes for a moment, allowing all his memories, fears, and pains to wash over him. In the darkness of the temple, he saw what he had long tried to forget, the moment of loss when his brother had died, when he couldn't save him. But instead of feeling helpless, Mason remembered that he had done everything he could, and that those memories no longer held power over him. He looked into the darkness and spoke softly, but with conviction. "I accept you. You are a part of me, but I will not let you define my life anymore." The darkness began to dim, the voices quieting. The dream catcher no longer appeared as a terrifying shadow. Mason felt the spell start to break, and in that moment, the temple became silent once more. He took a few more steps and saw the first light of dawn breaking from the horizon. The darkness retreated before the new sunrise. Mason realized that his struggle was never with the dream catcher itself, but with his own inner demons. And although the dream catcher could no longer control him, it remained a part of who he was. But now it was no longer a source of fear, but a resource of strength that helped him understand his inner nature. Mason left the temple and journeyed back, through the forests and fields, toward his home. He felt different, not free from the darkness, but motivated not to let it take his soul. He had become whole, understanding that the fight with the inner demon was not about destroying it, but learning to live with it in harmony. Where once he feared the nights and the darkness, now the nights were simply part of this world. Every new dream brought not only nightmares but the opportunity to understand himself more deeply. He no longer feared what hid in the dark, because he understood darkness was not the enemy. It was part of his world, and only by accepting it could he find the light within himself. The dream catcher no longer visited him in nightmares, but Mason knew that even if it returned, he would be ready. Because he was no longer the person he once was. Mason had become the true master of his fears. And though he no longer heard the footsteps of the dream catcher, sometimes, when the darkness enveloped him, he smiled. It was no longer terrifying. It was just a new beginning. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.